The country has been forced to face the horrors of hyperinflation, food shortages, and devastating depression. In spite of having the world's largest oil reserves, the country has had to resort to rationing electricity. A horrifying article by the New York Times depicts the state of Venezuelan hospitals, with children dying by the day due to a lack of medicine and basic supplies. This is the terrifying reality of socialism, the inevitable consequence of the economic policies of the late Hugo Chavez and his successor, Nicolas Maduro. Since 1999, the two socialist administrations championed price controls, nationalization of industries, and wealth redistribution. While it is not surprising to see these policies supported by Marxist politicians, what is deeply troubling is the amount of support the Venezuelan model has received from prominent economists over the years. During a visit in 2007, Joseph Stiglitz, who received the 2001 Nobel Prize in Economics, praised what he called positive policies of the Chavez administration. Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez appears to have had success in bringing health and education to the people in the poor neighborhoods of Caracas. It is not only important to have sustainable growth, but to ensure the best distribution of economic growth, for the benefit of all citizens. What should alarm Americans is that Stiglitz, who has been described as an influential advisor to Hillary Clinton, appears determined to bring similar policies here. Last year, as chief economist for the Roosevelt Institute, Stiglitz called for rewriting the rules of the American economy in a crusade against income inequality. His policy recommendations include higher taxes, more smarter regulation, and having the Federal Reserve focus more on unemployment than keeping inflation low, a call for an even more activist Fed than we've had since 2008. It is ironic that Stiglitz has chosen to brand his policy recommendations as some new innovative concept for the country, when it is simply doubling down on the interventionist policies that the nation has suffered from for over 100 years. Unfortunately, hearing such drivel come from a Nobel Prize winner isn't surprising. Carl Friedrich Israel has recently noted how the Nobel Prize has a history of being used as an endorsement of central planning. Socialist governments have long been able to count on American economists to serve as apologists for their schemes. In the 1960s, Paul Samuelson's widely read economics textbook infamously described the socialist economy of the Soviet Union as growing faster than America's. This explains how Bernie Sanders has been able to receive the endorsement of 170 self-proclaimed economists and financial experts during his campaign. Ludwig von Mises once wrote, "No one can escape the influence of a prevailing ideology." The images coming from Venezuela should serve as a potent reminder of how dangerous the ideas of men like Joseph Stiglitz are. Statism and economic interventionism must be rejected, in order for humanity to thrive. When a Venezuelan entrepreneur we know launched a manufacturing company in western Venezuela 2 decades ago, he never imagined he'd one day find himself facing jail time over the toilet paper in the factory's restrooms. But Venezuela has a way of turning yesterday's unimaginable into today's normal. The entrepreneur's ordeal started about a year ago, when the factory union began to insist on enforcing an obscure clause in its collective bargaining agreement requiring the factory's restrooms to be stocked with toilet paper at all times. The problem was that, amid deepening shortages of virtually all basic products, from rice and milk to deodorant and condoms, finding even one roll of toilet paper was nearly impossible in Venezuela, let alone finding enough for hundreds of workers. When the entrepreneur did manage to find some TP, his workers, understandably, took it home. It was just as hard for them to find it as it was for him. Toilet paper theft may sound like a farce, but it's a serious matter for the entrepreneur. Failing to stock the restrooms puts him in violation of his agreement with the union, and that puts his factory at risk of a prolonged strike, which in turn could lead to its being seized by the socialist government under the increasingly unpopular President Nicolas Maduro. So the entrepreneur turned to the black market, where he found an apparent solution, a supplier able to deliver, all at once, enough TP to last a few months. We're not naming the entrepreneur lest the government retaliate against him. The price was steep, but he had no other option. His company was at risk. But the problem wasn't solved. No sooner had the TP delivery reached the factory than the secret police swept in. Seizing the toilet paper, they claimed they had busted a major hoarding operation, part of a U.S.-backed economic war the Maduro government holds responsible for creating Venezuela's shortages in the first place. The entrepreneur and 3 of his top managers faced criminal prosecution and possible jail time. All of this over toilet paper. The entrepreneur is one of the real people behind those zany "there's no toilet paper in Venezuela" stories that play up the crisis for laughs and clicks. But to Venezuelans like the present writers, and the entrepreneur, there's nothing funny about the dark turn our country has taken. The experiment with 21st-century socialism as introduced by the late President Hugo Chavez, a self-described champion of the poor who vowed to distribute the country's wealth among the masses, and instead steered the nation toward the catastrophe the world is witnessing under his hand-picked successor Maduro, has been a cruel failure. Anatomy of a collapse. Developing countries, like teenagers, are prone to accidents. One pretty much expects them to suffer an economic crash, a political crisis, or both, with some regularity. The news coming from Venezuela including shortages as well as, most recently, riots over blackouts, the imposition of a 2-day workweek for government employees, supposedly aimed at saving electricity, and an accelerating drive to recall the president is dire, but also easy to dismiss as representing just one more of these recurrent episodes. That would be a mistake. What our country is going through is monstrously unique. It's nothing less than the collapse of a large, wealthy, seemingly modern, seemingly democratic nation just a few hours' flight from the United States. In the last 2 years Venezuela has experienced the kind of implosion that hardly ever occurs in a middle-income country like it outside of war. Mortality rates are skyrocketing, one public service after another is collapsing, triple-digit inflation has left more than 70% of the population in poverty, an unmanageable crime wave keeps people locked indoors at night, shoppers have to stand in line for hours to buy food, babies die in large numbers for lack of simple, inexpensive medicines and equipment in hospitals, as do the elderly and those suffering from chronic illnesses. But why? It's not that the country lacked money. Sitting atop the world's largest reserves of oil at the tail end of a frenzied oil boom, the government led first by Chavez and, since 2013, by Maduro, received over $1 trillion in oil revenues over the last 17 years. It faced virtually no institutional constraints on how to spend that unprecedented bonanza. It's true that oil prices have since fallen, a risk many people foresaw, and one that the government made no provision for, but that can hardly explain what's happened. Venezuela's garish implosion began well before the price of oil plummeted. Back in 2014, when oil was still trading north of $100 per barrel, Venezuelans were already facing acute shortages of basic things like bread or toiletries. On February 11 this year, Michael's mom Yamaris gave him the last lamotrigine tablet in their stash. None of Yamaris's usual pharmacies had any anticonvulsants in stock. She worked social media, which in Venezuela these days is filled with desperate people trying to source scarce medicines but no luck. She drove hours to track down a lead, but came up empty-handed. Cancer patients can't find chemotherapy drugs. Even malaria, which had essentially disappeared from Venezuela a generation ago and is easily treatable with inexpensive medicines, is making a deadly comeback. Venezuelan oil largesse has been scattered around the globe, from the $18 million handed to the American actor Danny Glover in 2007 to produce an ideologically appropriate film, still to be delivered, to the millions of Venezuelan dollars spent financing leftist parties and movements from El Salvador to Argentina to Spain and beyond. Meanwhile, the Venezuelan government can no longer afford to provide even rudimentary law and order, making Caracas, the capital, by some calculations one of the most murderous cities in the world. Drug traffickers run large sections of the countryside. Prison gang leaders keep military-style weapons on hand, and while grenade attacks still make the news, they are nothing new. Recently, the police captured an AT-4 anti-tank rocket launcher, basically, a bazooka from a suspect. The breakdown of law and order is so severe that even children are being robbed. At Nuestra Señora del Carmen School in El Cortijo, a struggling neighborhood of Caracas, supplies for the school lunch program have been stolen twice this year already. Thugs have broken into the school's pantry late at night after fresh food is delivered. The second burglary meant the school couldn't feed the kids for at least a week.